My son-in-law just called me an ignorant woman in French at his gallery opening in Manhattan, thinking I couldn't understand a single word. I'm Dr. Eleanor Washington, 68 years old, and I stood there in my simple navy cardigan and worn leather shoes, while Michael Bennett told his art world friends that my gift was worthless garbage from a tone-deaf old woman who knows nothing about culture. The sheet music trembling slightly in my hands wasn't garbage. It was an unpublished Debussy manuscript authenticated by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, valued at $890,000 by Sotheby's auction house, and it had a connection to Michael's dead sister that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his family's darkest tragedy. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply smiled and said, "That's interesting, Michael." Then I decided to show him exactly who he'd been underestimating for the past 3 years. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. The Meridian Contemporary Gallery in Soho was everything I wasn't. Polished, expensive, and aggressively modern. Polished concrete floors reflected track lighting that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Abstract paintings in primary colors hung on white walls so pristine they seemed to glow. The November evening had drawn Manhattan's art elite like moths to flame. Women in architectural black dresses, men in tailored suits that whispered wealth rather than shouted it, everyone holding wine glasses like fragile weapons. I stood near the back wall, trying to make myself small. At 68, I'd mastered the art of invisibility that comes naturally to older black women in spaces like these. My cardigan was clean but dated, purchased at Macy's 3 years ago when my husband James was still alive. My shoes were comfortable leather flats, scuffed at the toes. My hair was natural, silver gray, pulled back in a simple bun. I wore no jewelry except my wedding ring and the small gold cross my mother had given me 40 years ago. I watched my daughter Sarah move through the crowd with practiced grace. At 32, she'd learned to navigate Michael's world with the kind of ease I'd never quite managed. Her burgundy dress was elegant, her makeup flawless, her laugh bright and genuine as she charmed potential buyers. She caught my eye across the room and smiled, a real smile, the kind that crinkled her eyes and reminded me of when she was 7 years old and still thought her mama hung the moon. Michael Bennett was holding court near the center of the gallery, surrounded by admirers like a king among courtiers. At 35, he'd built himself into exactly what he wanted to be. Successful contemporary art dealer, cultural tastemaker, the kind of man who got written up in art news and invited to the right parties. His charcoal suit was custom-tailored, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile confident and warm, at least when directed at people who mattered. When he looked at me, the warmth disappeared. Not into coldness exactly, but into a kind of polite distance, the expression you'd give a stranger at a bus stop. Cordial, but completely disconnected. It hadn't always been this way. 3 years ago, when Michael first started dating Sarah, he'd been different, softer, broken in ways that made him seem almost fragile. His younger sister Olivia had died the year before, a car accident, the family said, and Michael was still raw with grief. He couldn't listen to classical music anymore, couldn't be around pianos or concert halls or anything that reminded him of Olivia's brilliance. She'd been 19, a piano student at Manhattan School of Music, and according to Sarah, she'd been extraordinarily talented. So Michael had fled into the visual arts, as far from music as he could get. When he met Sarah at a gallery opening in Chelsea, he'd been rebuilding himself piece by piece, creating a new identity that didn't include the weight of his sister's absence. I'd made a decision then, watching this grieving young man try to construct a life that wouldn't constantly hurt him. I decided not to tell him who I really was. Dr. Eleanor Washington, retired professor from Juilliard School, 35 years teaching music history and theory, specialist in French Impressionist composers, with particular expertise in Claude Debussy's unpublished works. Published author of 3 academic books and 47 journal articles, consultant to auction houses on rare musical manuscripts, collector of 18th and 19th century sheet music. Instead, I became Mrs. Washington, the piano tuner. It wasn't technically a lie. I did tune pianos, had been doing it as a hobby for 20 years, finding peace in the precision of it, the mathematical perfection of properly aligned strings. After James died suddenly of a heart attack 2 years ago, the piano tuning had become therapy, something to do with my hands while my heart slowly learned to beat in a world without him. But it wasn't the whole truth either. Michael needed a mother-in-law who wouldn't trigger his grief, who wouldn't make him feel inadequate about not understanding classical music, who would let him heal in peace. So that's what I gave him. For 3 years, I watched him slowly recover, build his gallery business, find confidence in his new world. I attended family dinners and said little. I asked polite questions about contemporary art and listened to his answers with genuine interest. I never mentioned Juilliard, never brought up Debussy or Ravel or any of the composers whose work I'd spent my life studying. I loved him because Sarah loved him, and I stayed quiet because silence seemed like the kindest gift I could give. But silence has a cost. Sarah had called me 3 weeks ago, her voice bright with hope. "Mom, Michael's having a big gallery opening on November 15th. It's a huge deal. His first show featuring emerging artists from the gallery's new fellowship program. He's been working on it for months." "That's wonderful, sweetheart." "I was thinking," she paused, "it might be nice if you came, and maybe brought him something. Not expensive, just meaningful. Something that shows you understand his work, his world. I think he'd really appreciate it." The subtext was clear. "Please try to connect with my husband. Please help bridge this distance between you." I'd thought about it for days. What could I possibly give Michael that would mean something? I knew nothing about contemporary art beyond what I'd politely absorbed at family dinners. My world was Baroque cantatas and romantic nocturnes, not abstract expressionism and conceptual installations. Then I remembered the manuscript. 5 years ago, I'd attended an estate sale in Westport, Connecticut. The seller was Patricia Holmes, an elderly woman whose husband had been a collector of classical music memorabilia. Most of the collection was standard fare, signed concert programs, vintage recordings, reproduction scores of famous works. But I'd found something extraordinary buried in a box of miscellaneous papers, an unpublished Debussy composition. Reverie pour Olivia, dated 1894. I'd known immediately it might be authentic. The paper quality, the ink, the handwriting all suggested the late 19th century. But authentication of musical manuscripts is expensive and time-consuming. It had taken me 2 years and $12,000 to confirm what I'd suspected. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France verified the paper and ink composition as consistent with Debussy's known materials from that period. Sotheby's manuscripts department provided a valuation of $890,000. The Debussy Foundation authenticated the handwriting against exemplars from their archives. I'd planned to donate it to a museum eventually, but it had been sitting in my safety deposit box for 3 years, waiting for the right moment. When Sarah asked me to bring Michael something meaningful, I'd thought, maybe this was it. Not because of the money, Michael would never accept something that valuable, but because of the name. Olivia. Debussy had written Reverie pour Olivia for someone, probably a student or friend. The composition had never been published, never performed in any documented concert. It was a small piece, intimate and gentle, the kind of music meant for private moments rather than grand stages. After Michael's sister died, I'd done what any grieving person does in the internet age. I'd researched her, read reviews of her performances, found archived programs from her recitals, watched the few videos available online, and I discovered something that made my heart ache. 6 months before she died, Olivia Bennett had performed Reverie pour Olivia at a student recital at Manhattan School of Music. According to the archived program notes, she'd told the audience, "This piece was written for someone named Olivia over a century ago. Tonight I get to bring her voice back to life." I'd already owned the manuscript when I learned that. The connection was pure coincidence. Olivia was a common enough name in the 1890s, but it felt like fate. Maybe, I'd thought, this manuscript could help Michael remember his sister with joy instead of just pain. Maybe it could be a bridge between us, a way to show him that I understood loss, that I honored Olivia's memory even though I'd never met her. I should have known better. Michael saw me as soon as I entered the gallery, and I watched his expression shift through several stages. Surprise that I'd actually come, mild concern that I might embarrass him, and finally professional courtesy settling over his face like a mask. "Eleanor." He crossed the floor with his dealer's smile firmly in place. Behind him, I could see several serious-looking people watching. Potential buyers, probably, or art critics whose opinions could make or break careers. "Sarah said you might stop by. Not 'I'm glad you came' or 'thank you for being here.' Just acknowledgement of my presence, like checking off an item on a to-do list. I brought you something." I held out the protective archival sleeve containing the manuscript. Through the clear plastic, you could see aged cream-colored paper, handwritten musical notation in brown ink that had faded slightly over 130 years. Michael accepted it with the kind of polite enthusiasm you'd give an obligation gift from a distant relative. Sheet music. He glanced at it briefly. That's thoughtful. The way he said thoughtful made it clear it was anything but. He held the manuscript up to examine it more closely, and I saw his expression shift from polite interest to barely concealed amusement. The small crowd around us, gallery assistants in their 20s, art bloggers with expensive cameras, middle-aged collectors in designer clothing, sensed something happening and moved closer. Interesting, Michael said, his voice carrying just enough volume to include his growing audience. Where did you find this, Eleanor? An estate sale in Connecticut, about 5 years ago. Michael nodded knowingly, sharing a look with his companions. Ah, estate sales. You have to be careful with those. Lots of reproductions floating around these days. The way he said reproductions made it absolutely clear what he thought of my purchase. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame, but from the sudden realization of what was about to happen. A woman in an expensive black dress leaned closer. She had the kind of sleek bob haircut that cost $300 to maintain and carried herself with the confidence of old money. What kind of music is it? Appears to be classical, Michael said, tilting the manuscript toward her like a teacher showing students a cautionary example. Probably printed from a website. You can get anything online these days. Scan a museum image, print it on aged-looking paper, put it in a nice sleeve. Very convincing to the untrained eye. Several people chuckled appreciatively. Michael was entertaining them, demonstrating his expertise. I could have stopped it right then. Could have pulled out the authentication documents I'd brought with me. The letters from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the Sotheby's valuation, the Debussy Foundation verification. 3 years of paperwork, all neatly organized in a folder in my purse. But something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity about how far he'd take this. Maybe it was the memory of 3 years of polite dismissal, of being treated like a well-meaning but simple woman who couldn't possibly understand his sophisticated world. Maybe it was just the stubborn part of me that wanted to see exactly who Michael had become. Eleanor, Sarah appeared at my elbow, her voice quiet and concerned. Maybe we should— No, it's fine, Michael interrupted smoothly, his professional persona fully engaged now. This is actually educational. People need to understand how to spot reproductions in the marketplace. He gestured toward the manuscript like a professor with a teaching prop, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just casual dismissal anymore. This was performance. See, real musical manuscripts, especially valuable ones, are incredibly rare, Michael continued. The chances of finding an authentic piece by a major composer at a random estate sale are essentially zero. Museums, universities, private collectors with serious money, they've already acquired anything of real value. What's left are reproductions, forgeries, and wishful thinking. The crowd murmured agreement. His logic sounded entirely reasonable. The paper quality looks modern, offered a young gallery assistant, a thin blonde woman in her mid-20s who was clearly trying to impress Michael with her observational skills. Exactly, Michael said, nodding approvingly. Real period manuscripts have very specific aging characteristics: foxing, discoloration patterns, particular types of paper degradation. This is clearly contemporary paper, probably laser printed. More knowing chuckles from the crowd. I felt like I was watching a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away. Plus, Michael continued, warming to his subject, authentic manuscripts come with extensive documentation, provenance papers, authentication certificates from recognized institutions, expert verification. They don't just show up in plastic sleeves from estate sales. He turned back to me with an expression that might have been kindness if you didn't look too closely. Eleanor, I appreciate the thought, I really do. But you have to understand that the art and collectibles market is full of scams targeting people who don't have expertise in these areas. People like you, his tone said. Simple people who don't know better. Sarah was gripping my arm now, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Michael, maybe— And let's be honest, Michael said, cutting her off again. This was his show now, his audience. Even if this were somehow authentic, which it's not, what would a piano tuner be doing with a manuscript worth hundreds of thousands of dollars? That got the biggest laugh yet. The absurdity of it struck everyone as genuinely funny. Eleanor Washington, The quiet older woman in the cardigan, owning museum-quality art. Ridiculous. I should have said something then. Should have defended myself, produced my evidence, stopped this before it went any further. But I didn't, because Michael made his critical mistake. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the adrenaline of performing for his peers. Maybe it was just 3 years of accumulated frustration finally bubbling over. Frustration at having a mother-in-law who didn't fit his carefully curated world, who made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate, who reminded him of things he wanted to forget. Whatever the reason, Michael switched to French. Mes amis, he said to his companions, his voice dropping into the smooth confidence of someone speaking a language he assumed I didn't understand. C'est exactement le problème avec des gens comme ma belle-mère. My friends, this is exactly the problem with people like my mother-in-law. Elle ne comprend pas la différence entre l'art véritable et les reproductions bon marché. She doesn't understand the difference between real art and cheap reproductions. The words hit me like a slap. Not because of the insult itself. I'd been called worse things by better people during my academic career, but because of the casual cruelty of it, the assumption that I couldn't understand, the performance of superiority for an audience, the absolute certainty that he could mock me to my face and I'd never know. I stood very still, my face carefully neutral, while Michael continued in French. Elle ne sait rien de la culture, he said, gesturing toward me with theatrical pity. Elle pense qu'un morceau de papier avec des notes griffonnées a de la valeur parce qu'elle l'a acheté dans un vide-grenier. She knows nothing about culture. She thinks a piece of paper with scribbled notes has value because she bought it at a garage sale. Sarah was looking back and forth between us, confusion clear on her face. She'd taken Spanish in high school, not French. She had no idea what her husband was saying about her mother, but I understood every syllable. I'd spent a semester in Paris during graduate school, studying at the conservatoire. I'd presented papers at conferences in Lyon and Marseille. I'd interviewed aging musicians in their native language, transcribed historical letters, translated Debussy's personal correspondence for my doctoral dissertation. French wasn't just a language I'd learned. It was one I'd lived in, dreamed in, thought in during some of the most formative years of my life. And now I was listening to my son-in-law use it as a weapon, secure in his assumption that the ignorant old woman before him couldn't possibly understand. Et regardez comment elle se tient là, Michael continued, his audience leaning in to catch every word, even though most of them probably didn't speak French either. They were just enjoying the performance, the casual display of cultural superiority. And look how she stands there. Elle pense probablement qu'elle a fait une découverte majeure, un trésor caché. She probably thinks she's made a major discovery, a hidden treasure. The crowd's laughter was getting more confident now. They were feeding off Michael's energy, enjoying this demonstration of the gulf between the cultured and the naive. I felt Sarah's grip tighten on my arm. "Mom," she whispered, "let's just go. This is—" But before she could finish, something unexpected happened. A man I hadn't noticed before stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. He was well-dressed, probably in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine expertise rather than social posturing. "Excuse me," he said to Michael, "but could I take a closer look at that manuscript?" Michael paused mid-sentence, his French commentary interrupted. He turned to the newcomer with the slightly annoyed expression of someone whose performance has been disrupted. "Of course," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Though I should warn you, it's almost certainly a reproduction." The man took the manuscript carefully, holding it by the edges of the protective sleeve. He studied it with the kind of attention I recognized immediately. This wasn't someone looking at a curiosity. This was someone who knew exactly what they were examining. "The notation style is very interesting," he said after a long moment, his voice measured and thoughtful. Quite characteristic of late 19th century French composers. The hand is exceptionally fluid. Michael's confidence wavered slightly. Well, yes, whoever created the reproduction obviously did their research, but the paper quality gives it away immediately. The man looked up, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Disagreement, maybe even annoyance. "Actually, the paper looks quite authentic to me. That's definitely period stock. You can tell by the texture, the way the fibers have aged, and particularly by how the ink has settled and oxidized over time. Modern reproductions simply can't replicate that kind of deterioration pattern." The energy in the crowd shifted. Michael's neat narrative was being challenged by someone who clearly had expertise. "I'm sorry," Michael said, his dealer instincts kicking in. "Who are you exactly?" "Dr. James Patterson." The man extended his hand. "I'm a concert pianist. I perform regularly at Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, occasionally internationally. I've also handled quite a few historical manuscripts over the years. Authentication work. Acquisition consulting for private collectors." I felt my heart skip. Dr. James Patterson. I knew the name. He'd performed Debussy's Complete Preludes at Carnegie Hall 2 years ago. The New York Times had called it definitive. I'd wanted to attend, but had been dealing with James's funeral arrangements at the time. Michael's face flushed slightly. He was losing control of his audience, and he knew it. "Dr. Patterson," he said, forcing a diplomatic smile, "I appreciate your input, but I deal with authentication issues professionally in the art world. This manuscript simply doesn't have the proper documentation to be considered authentic." "What kind of documentation would you expect?" "Doctor?" Patterson asked, and something in his tone made me think he was testing Michael, seeing how deep his knowledge actually went. Michael seized the opportunity to regain his authority. "Provenance papers from the source institution. Authentication certificates from organizations like the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. Valuation assessments from recognized auction houses. Sotheby's, Christie's, that caliber. Expert verification from the Debussy Foundation." He ticked off each requirement on his fingers like a professor grading a failing student. He turned back to me, switching to English but keeping the condescending tone. "Eleanor, you mentioned this came from an estate sale. Did the seller provide any paperwork? Any documentation at all?" This was my moment. I could feel the weight of the folder in my purse. 3 years of authentication, every single item Michael had just mentioned, and more. Letters with official letterheads, signatures from internationally recognized experts, enough documentation to fill a small filing cabinet. But something made me hesitate. I looked at Michael's face, flushed with wine and confidence, certain he was right, convinced he was educating these people about how the world really worked. I looked at the crowd, some sympathetic to me now, some still enjoying the show. I looked at Sarah, mortification and fury warring on her face, and I thought about the past 3 years. Every family dinner where Michael had explained things to me like I was a child. Every time he'd changed the subject when I tried to contribute to conversations about culture or history. Every polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes when he looked at me. How far would he go? How cruel would he get when he thought he was safe? "I have some paperwork at home," I said quietly. Michael's smile became genuinely pitying. "Eleanor, I'm sure you have some kind of certificate of authenticity, but you have to understand those are incredibly easy to fake. Real authentication requires institutional verification from multiple sources, cross-referenced and independently confirmed." He turned back to Dr. Patterson, professional to professional. "The problem with estate sales is that people find items they don't understand and build stories around them. They want to believe they've discovered something valuable, so they invest in fake documentation to support that belief. It's a common psychological pattern." Dr. Patterson was studying my face now, not the manuscript. Something about my expression seemed to intrigue him. "What composer is listed on this piece?" he asked. Michael glanced at the manuscript. "Claude Debussy, Reverie pour Olivia, dated 1894. Dr. Patterson's eyebrows rose sharply. "Reverie pour Olivia? I've never heard of that composition." "Exactly," Michael said triumphantly, "because it doesn't exist in Debussy's catalog. If this were real, it would be documented somewhere." But Dr. Patterson was shaking his head slowly. "Actually, that's not necessarily true. Debussy wrote dozens of small pieces that were never published. Gifts for students, compositions for friends, experimental works he never formalized. Many have been lost to history. The Debussy Foundation has been trying to compile a comprehensive catalog for decades, but they estimate at least 30 to 40% of his small works are still undocumented or missing." Michael's confidence was cracking now. His simple narrative of fraud and ignorance was becoming complicated by actual expertise. "Dr. Patterson, surely you're not suggesting this could be an authentic Debussy manuscript?" "I'm suggesting, Doctor," Patterson replied carefully, "that dismissing it without proper examination would be premature. The physical characteristics I'm seeing, the paper aging, the ink oxidation, the compositional style, are all consistent with an 1890s Debussy work." The crowd was completely silent now, sensing real tension between the two men. Michael's art world authority was being challenged by musical expertise, and the outcome wasn't certain. That's when Elena Rodriguez, the gallery owner, approached our group. She'd been watching from across the room, and her expression suggested concern. Elena was in her mid-40s, elegant in a charcoal pantsuit, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She'd built Meridian Contemporary from nothing over 15 years, and she had the kind of sharp instincts that came from navigating Manhattan's brutal art scene. "Michael," she said quietly, touching his elbow, "perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office." But Michael was too deep in now. His reputation was on the line in front of potential clients and critics. He couldn't afford to back down without looking weak or uninformed. "Elena, it's fine," he said, his voice carrying across the gallery with practiced projection. "I think it's important that people understand how to evaluate authenticity claims in the collectibles market. This is educational." He held up the manuscript again, his voice taking on the confident tone of a lecturer. "This is a perfect example of wishful thinking becoming expensive delusion. My mother-in-law has convinced herself she owns a valuable Debussy manuscript, probably based on some forged documentation she purchased along with it." I felt Sarah stiffen beside me. "Michael, stop," she said, her voice low and dangerous. But he wasn't listening. He was looking directly at me now, and I saw something in his eyes that hurt more than any of his words. Genuine pity mixed with barely concealed irritation. "Eleanor, I'm not trying to embarrass you," he said in the tone someone might use with a confused elderly relative. "But you need to accept reality here. This is a reproduction. Probably worth about $20 at most. Maybe you paid $100 for it at that estate sale. Maybe $200 if they really took advantage of you. But it's not valuable. It's not authentic. And holding on to the fantasy that it is will only cause you more disappointment." $20. For a manuscript I'd spent 3 years and $12,000 authenticating. For a piece of music that had changed my understanding of Debussy's late Romantic period. For a composition that had a connection to Michael's family that would shatter everything he thought he knew. I looked around the gallery at the faces watching me, some sympathetic, some amused, all waiting to see how the embarrassed old woman would handle being publicly exposed as a fool, and I made my decision. "Michael," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd with unexpected clarity. "Before you continue, I have a question." Something in my tone made people pause. Maybe it was the sudden stillness in my voice, or the way I'd stopped looking embarrassed and started looking focused. The room seemed to hold its breath. "What's your question, Eleanor?" Michael asked, still confident but sensing some shift in the energy around us. "You mentioned that real manuscripts come with documentation from institutions like the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. That's correct? And valuation assessments from auction houses like Sotheby's or Christie's." "Yes. And that Debussy never wrote a piece called Reverie pour Olivia." Michael nodded firmly. "Right. It's not in any catalog of his works." Dr. Patterson was watching me intently now. Elena Rodriguez had moved closer, her face troubled. "Interesting," I said, he said. "Because you seem to know quite a bit about musical authentication for someone who works exclusively in contemporary visual art." Michael's smile faltered slightly. "I make it my business to understand all areas of the art market. I have a broad cultural education." "From where?" The question seemed to surprise him. "From where? What do you mean? Where did you study French musical history? Which university? Which professors? Which primary texts did you read?" Michael's confidence was wavering now. "I'm largely self-taught in that area. I read extensively." "Ah," I nodded thoughtfully. "So when you say Debussy never wrote Reverie pour Olivia, you're basing that on what exactly? Which catalog? The Leisure Catalog? The Debussy Foundation's preliminary listings? François Lejour's thematic catalog from 1977? Or the updated version from 2001? The silence that followed was absolute. Michael's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Dr. Patterson stepped forward, and I saw the beginning of a smile on his face. "Actually, neither of those catalogs is comprehensive for Debussy's unpublished works. The Foundation has been working on a complete catalog since 1990, but it's still incomplete. They freely admit there are significant gaps." Michael shot Dr. Patterson an irritated look. "Fine, but the point remains. This manuscript doesn't have proper documentation." "You're absolutely right," I agreed, and the admission seemed to relax him slightly. "Proper documentation is essential for authentication. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder I'd been carrying all evening. It was burgundy leather, embossed with gold lettering. Authentication documents, Debussy MS 1894.RPO. Which is why I brought this. Michael's face went pale as I opened the folder to reveal a stack of official documents, each in its own protective plastic sleeve. Even from a distance, the letterheads were clearly visible. Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Sotheby's Department of Manuscripts and Rare Books, Fondation Claude Debussy. What is that? Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The documentation you said was necessary, I replied calmly. Authentication certificate from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, reference number BNF-MS-2024-0847, dated March 18, 2024. Sotheby's valuation assessment, dated March 30, 2024, and verification from the Debussy Foundation confirming the manuscript's authenticity, dated April 2, 2024. The gallery had gone completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on those polished concrete floors. May I see those? Dr. Patterson asked, his voice careful. I handed him the documents. He studied them carefully, his expression growing more amazed with each page he turned. He held one letter up to the light, examining the watermark. He ran his finger over an embossed seal. He read through dense paragraphs of technical analysis in French, English, and what looked like German. These are real, he said finally, his voice soft with wonder. This is legitimate institutional authentication. Multiple independent sources, cross-verified results, chemical analysis of the paper and ink. He looked up at me with new respect. Mrs. Washington, this is museum-quality documentation. Michael was staring at the papers like they were written in an alien language. How did you... The question, Michael, I said gently, is not how I obtained proper authentication. The question is why you were so certain I couldn't have. Elena Rodriguez was reading over Dr. Patterson's shoulder now. She pulled out one page, a letter on heavy cream-colored paper with an elaborate letterhead. Professor Cooper, she said suddenly, her voice filled with recognition. Everyone turned to look at her. You're Professor Eleanor Washington, she continued, her words tumbling out faster now. You gave a guest lecture at Columbia University. It must have been 7 or 8 years ago. African-American influences in French Impressionist music. You talked about how Debussy was influenced by the cakewalk and early jazz structures, how his exposure to Black American performers in Paris shaped his harmonic language. The crowd stirred. The name meant something to them, even if they couldn't quite place it. I was getting my master's in art history, Elena continued. Your lecture changed how I understood the intersection of race and culture in fin de siècle Paris. You were brilliant. Professor? Michael's voice was barely audible. Dr. Patterson looked up from the documents with sudden understanding. Eleanor Washington, of course, you're the Eleanor Washington from Juilliard. I was, I said simply, for 35 years. Michael was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, like I'd suddenly materialized from another dimension. You're a professor? At Juilliard? Retired now. I left in 2020. But you tune pianos, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I've seen your van. Washington Piano Services. I tune pianos because I enjoy staying connected to the instruments, I replied. It's a hobby, not a profession. It helps me stay grounded in the physical reality of music, the mechanics, the mathematics of proper tuning. After spending decades in theory and history, there's something deeply satisfying about the practical work. The crowd was murmuring now, reassessing everything they'd witnessed. The narrative had flipped completely. Michael's expert dismissal of my gift had just been exposed as uninformed arrogance by someone with actual credentials. Dr. Patterson was still examining the documents, shaking his head in admiration. Dr. Washington, your book on Debussy's unpublished works is considered the definitive text in the field. Every serious pianist has read it. I've read it 3 times. You wrote a book? Sarah's voice came from beside me, small and confused. Mom, I didn't know you wrote a book. I looked at my daughter, saw the hurt and confusion in her eyes. 3 books, sweetheart, and about 47 journal articles. But you never asked about my work before I retired, and after your father died it seemed less important than other things. I thought you worked with pianos, Sarah whispered. You always just said you worked with pianos. Michael found his voice, though it came out strangled. Why? Why would you hide this? Why let me think you were just a piano tuner? It was a good question, and it temporarily shifted the focus away from his own mistakes. I could see the strategy in it. Reframe the situation. Make me the deceptive one instead of confronting his own humiliation. You never asked about my background, I said simply. But Sarah must have known, Michael insisted, grasping for solid ground. She would have told me. I looked at my daughter again. Sarah, did you know I was a professor at Juilliard? No, she whispered, tears starting to stream down her face. You never... I knew you taught music, but I thought it was like piano lessons to kids or something. You never talked about it. Michael seized on this like a lifeline. So you've been lying to your own daughter for years? Hiding your real identity? Why would anyone do that? The accusation hung in the air, and I could see it working. The crowd was with him again. His logic felt sound. Why would anyone conceal such prestigious credentials? Michael, Elena said quietly, maybe this isn't the place. No, Michael interrupted, his confidence returning as he found his footing. I think we deserve an explanation. This whole situation is bizarre. He turned to address the crowd directly, and I recognized the technique, a trial lawyer's strategy, making his audience into a jury. A retired Juilliard professor, pretending to be a working-class piano tuner, showing up at my gallery opening with $1 million manuscript she's apparently been hiding for years. He gestured dramatically. Don't you think this is strange? Why would someone conceal their expertise and then dramatically reveal it like this? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gallery. Michael was successfully redirecting their focus from his own mistakes to my supposed deception. And another thing, Michael continued, warming to his theme. If Dr. Washington really is an expert on French composers, why didn't she correct me earlier? Why let me embarrass myself before revealing her credentials? Why stand there silently while I explained, incorrectly apparently, about authentication and catalogs? Dr. Patterson looked troubled. That is an interesting question. Michael nodded eagerly. Exactly. It's like she was setting me up, waiting for me to make mistakes so she could humiliate me publicly, letting me dig myself into a hole deeper and deeper. The crowd was nodding now. Michael's narrative was compelling, the vengeful professor engineering her son-in-law's public embarrassment. Which raises another question, Michael said, his voice growing stronger, more confident. Why this manuscript? Why this specific piece, Doctor? Washington could have brought any number of authentic compositions to demonstrate her expertise. Why choose something so dramatically expensive? Why choose something designed to make my dismissal look as foolish as possible? He was building momentum now, and I could see the crowd swaying with him. Even Sarah looked uncertain, torn between loyalty to her mother and confusion about what she was learning. And why tonight? Michael continued. Why my gallery opening? Why this venue in front of all these people? Michael, I said quietly, you're being paranoid. Am I? He turned to me, and I saw real pain in his eyes now, mixed with the anger. Eleanor, think about it from my perspective. You've been lying to us for 3 years about who you really are. Tonight you show up at my professional event with nearly $1 million worth of sheet music, let me publicly mock it, then dramatically reveal your true identity to maximum humiliating effect. He gestured to the crowd. If that's not a setup, what is it? The logic was working. People were nodding, seeing the pattern Michael was describing. And you know what the worst part is? Michael's voice was rising now, emotion cracking through his professional veneer. This whole performance is about classical music, the one subject you know I can't bear to discuss. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. This was getting deeply personal. My sister died 3 years ago, Michael announced to the room, his voice breaking. Olivia was a music student at Manhattan School of Music, incredibly talented. Her death destroyed our family, destroyed me. I couldn't listen to classical music anymore without falling apart, so I moved into visual art, as far from music as I could get. Several people in the crowd looked genuinely moved. Michael's pain was real, raw. Dr. Washington knows this, he continued. Sarah must have told her. So what does she do? She brings me a piece of classical music, not just any music, but an expensive, impressive piece specifically designed to showcase her expertise in the field I abandoned because it was too painful. Michael's eyes were bright with tears now, but his voice remained strong. She waits for me to reject it, probably knowing I would because classical music triggers my grief. Then she uses my rejection to humiliate me in front of my peers, my clients, everyone who matters in my professional world. He turned to me directly. That's not just deceptive, Eleanor. It's cruel, using my grief about Olivia against me to engineer some kind of twisted revenge. The gallery was completely silent except for Michael's ragged breathing. He'd reframed the entire evening, cast himself as the grieving brother being manipulated by a calculating professor who'd used insider knowledge of family tragedy to orchestrate public humiliation. Elena looked stricken. Dr. Patterson was shaking his head sadly. Even Sarah seemed uncertain now, looking between her husband and her mother like she didn't know who to believe. Michael, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the pain I felt. That's not what this is. Isn't it? He interrupted. Then explain it to me, Professor Washington. Explain why you hid your identity for 3 years. Explain why you chose tonight to reveal it. Explain why you picked classical music, the one thing guaranteed to trigger my grief about Olivia, as your weapon of choice. Michael held up the manuscript like evidence in a trial. This isn't a gift, Professor. This is psychological warfare, and everyone in this room just watched you execute it perfectly. The crowd was completely with Michael now. His pain was real, his logic compelling. I'd been cast as the villain, the cruel academic who'd used a family's tragedy to engineer professional revenge. You want to know what I think really happened? Michael continued, his voice carrying across the gallery with theatrical precision. I think you've resented me for years. Resented that I moved Sarah into the contemporary art world instead of your precious classical music scene. Resented that I couldn't appreciate your area of expertise because it reminded me too much of my dead sister. Resented that I was happy, successful, building a life that didn't revolve around music. He was building to a crescendo now, fully committed to his narrative. So you waited. You planned. You found the most expensive, most impressive piece of musical history you could acquire. Then you set me up to reject it so you could humiliate me in front of everyone who matters to my career. Michael's voice dropped to something almost like wonder. The only question is, how long have you been planning this? Since the wedding? Since Olivia died? How long have you been waiting to destroy me? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. The gallery was completely silent, waiting for my response to Michael's devastating narrative. Every face was turned toward me, some sympathetic, some skeptical, all expecting an explanation. I looked at my son-in-law, this young man I'd watched struggle with grief for 3 years, now standing before his peers with tears streaming down his face, convinced I'd engineered his humiliation. I thought about the real reason I'd hidden my identity, the careful calculation that had gone into every family dinner, every polite demurral, every time I'd bitten my tongue when he'd mansplained something I'd literally written books about. I thought about Olivia, a girl I'd never met, but whose musical legacy I'd honored in ways Michael couldn't imagine. And I thought about what Sarah needed to hear right now, watching her mother and husband tear each other apart in front of Manhattan's art elite. Michael, I said quietly, you're right about several things. The admission surprised everyone, including Michael himself. His mouth opened slightly, prepared for argument, not agreement. I did hide my identity from you. I did choose to reveal it tonight, and I did know that classical music would be difficult for you. Michael's expression grew triumphant, vindicated. Several people in the crowd nodded. The professor was confessing. But, I continued, and something in my tone made the room go still again. You're wrong about why. Then explain it, Michael demanded. I looked around the gallery one more time at these strangers who'd become witnesses to our family's breaking point. These weren't the circumstances I'd imagined for this conversation, but perhaps they were the right ones. I hid my identity, I said clearly, because you needed me to. Michael's confidence faltered. What? 3 years ago, when you married Sarah, you were broken. Olivia's death had shattered your relationship with music, and you were building a new life around visual art. The last thing you needed was a mother-in-law who would constantly remind you of the world you'd lost. I paused, letting that sink in. So I became Mrs. Washington, the piano tuner, someone safe, someone who wouldn't trigger your grief every time we had dinner, someone who wouldn't make you feel inadequate about not understanding classical music, someone who would let you heal in peace. Dr. Patterson was listening intently now. Elena had tears in her eyes. For 3 years, I continued, I watched you heal, watched you build confidence in the art world, Watched you create a new identity that didn't include the weight of Olivia's absence. Michael's face was changing, his anger being replaced by confusion, then something that looked like shame. But I also watched you become someone else, I said, my voice still gentle but with an edge of steel now. Someone harder, more dismissive, more willing to look down on people you considered culturally inferior. I never, Michael started. Tonight, I interrupted quietly, you spent 30 minutes publicly mocking a gift from your mother-in-law because you assumed she was too ignorant to understand your cruelty. You performed your superiority for an audience, using someone you thought couldn't defend herself as entertainment for your peers. The words landed like physical blows. Michael's face crumpled. That's not the man who married my daughter, I said. That's not the man who loved Olivia enough to change his entire career path rather than face daily reminders of her absence. Michael was crying now, but silently, tears streaming down his face. Grief changes us, Michael, I said softly. Sometimes it makes us harder, more defensive. We protect ourselves by deciding that other people aren't worthy of our consideration, that their feelings don't matter as much as our pain. I took a step closer to him. I didn't bring this manuscript to humiliate you. I brought it because I hoped, you were finally ready to remember Olivia with joy instead of just pain. Dr. Patterson stepped forward, his voice gentle. Dr. Washington, if I may ask, how did you know about Olivia? I hesitated. This was the part I'd hoped to share privately, in a quiet moment over coffee, not in front of 50 strangers in a Soho gallery. But perhaps there was no perfect time for painful truths. I didn't attend her final performance, I said carefully. I never met her. But after she died, Sarah was devastated. She'd talked about her boyfriend's brilliant sister for months, how talented she was, how proud Michael was of her. Sarah's hand found mine, squeezing tight. I wanted to understand what kind of music mattered to the young man my daughter was falling in love with, I continued. So I did what any scholar does when they want to understand something. I researched. Michael was watching me now with an expression I couldn't quite read. I read reviews of Olivia's performances, found archived programs from her recitals, watched the few videos available online of her student performances. I paused. She was extraordinary, Michael. Truly gifted. I know, he whispered. I already owned this manuscript when I learned about the connection, I said, gesturing to the document still in Dr. Patterson's hands. I'd purchased it 3 years before Olivia died, had it authenticated over a 2-year period. But when I was researching her repertoire, I discovered something that made my heart ache. The gallery was absolutely silent. Even the traffic noise from the street seemed to fade away. 6 months before she died, Olivia performed Reverie pour Olivia at a student recital at Manhattan School of Music. According to the archived program notes I found online, she announced it to the audience with these exact words. I closed my eyes, remembering. This piece was written for someone named Olivia over a century ago. Tonight I get to bring her voice back to life. Michael made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. That's exactly what she would say. Exactly. Olivia always talked about music like it was alive, like composers were writing letters to the future that she got to deliver. I know, I said softly. I could hear it in every review of her performances. The critics all mentioned it. How she made audiences feel like they were witnessing something being born rather than simply performed. Michael collapsed into a nearby chair, still holding the manuscript against his chest like a talisman. You bought this because of Olivia? No, I said. I bought it because it's a remarkable piece of music history. But I kept it. I had it authenticated. I brought it here tonight. All of that was because of Olivia. Because I wanted to honor her memory, even though I never knew her. Sarah was crying openly now, mascara running down her cheeks. Elena handed her a tissue from somewhere. Dr. Washington, Elena said, her voice shaking slightly. This manuscript, if it's authenticated as genuine Debussy, valued at $890,000. Why would you give it away? Because some things are worth more than money, I said simply. Olivia brought this music to life. She may have been one of the only people in the last century to perform this specific composition. That connection between her artistry and Debussy's original intention, that's priceless. Dr. Patterson was still studying the authentication documents with something like awe. These are incredibly thorough. The chemical analysis alone must have cost thousands. The Bibliothèque Nationale doesn't do authentication cheaply. $12,000 total, I said, over 2 years. It was worth every penny. Michael looked up at me, his face ravaged by tears. Professor Washington, Eleanor, I owe you an apology that goes deeper than words can express. Michael stood slowly, still clutching the manuscript. He looked around the gallery at the faces watching him. Potential clients, critics, colleagues, all witnesses to what had unfolded. I need to say something, he announced, his voice rough but clear. And I need everyone here to hear it. Elena started to speak, but Michael shook his head. No, this needs to be public. I humiliated Eleanor publicly. My apology needs to be just as public. He turned to face me fully. Dr. Washington, for 3 years I've treated you with dismissal and condescension. I've explained things to you that you literally wrote the definitive academic texts about. I've made assumptions about your intelligence, your education, your worth, all based on how you dressed, how you spoke, what I thought your profession was. His voice broke, but he pushed through. Tonight I stood in front of all these people and called you ignorant, in French because I assumed you were too uneducated to understand. I mocked a gift you gave me with love and thought. I used you as entertainment, as an example of everything wrong with people who don't fit my sophisticated image. Several people in the crowd looked away, uncomfortable with his raw honesty. And the worst part, Michael continued, is that I did it because of my own pain, because classical music reminds me of Olivia, and somehow, unconsciously, I made you pay for that grief. I made you small and ignorant in my mind so I wouldn't have to confront the real reason I was uncomfortable around you. He looked down at the manuscript. You brought me Olivia's music. You honored her memory in ways I've been too broken to do for 3 years. And I repaid that gift by humiliating you. Michael's shoulders shook. I'm sorry. It's not enough, but I'm so sorry. I stepped forward and took his hand. Michael, grief does terrible things to us. It makes us hurt people we love. It makes us cruel when we mean to protect ourselves. That's not an excuse, he said. No, I agreed. But it's an explanation. And sometimes understanding why we hurt each other is the first step toward healing. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat softly. Dr. Washington, if I may, I'm familiar with your work beyond just your academic publications. You've done extensive philanthropic work in music education. I felt my cheeks warm. Some, when I can. The Olivia Bennett Memorial Scholarship, Dr. Patterson said, watching Michael's face. At Manhattan School of Music. You established that, didn't you? Michael's head snapped up. What? I established a small scholarship fund about 2 years ago, I said quietly. After I learned about Olivia's story, about how she struggled with the pressure of perfectionism, I wanted to help other young musicians who might be facing the same challenges. How much? Michael asked, his voice barely audible. $25,000 annually. It provides full tuition for one piano student, with the requirement that they participate in regular mental health counseling and peer support groups. The goal is to help talented students understand that their worth isn't determined by perfect performances. Michael was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. You created a scholarship in my sister's name? For 2 years you've been supporting music students in her memory, and you never told us? It felt private, I said. Yeah, I said. Grief is private. I didn't want to intrude on your healing by making you feel obligated to acknowledge something I chose to do. Elena was shaking her head in wonder. Dr. Washington, that level of generosity, combined with the authentication costs for this manuscript, you must have spent nearly $40,000 honoring a young woman you never met. My husband James left me comfortable when he passed, I said. We never had money to spare when he was alive. He was a high school music teacher, and we lived carefully. But his life insurance and our savings were substantial. I could think of no better use for it than supporting young artists and preserving musical history. Michael stood abruptly. I want to contribute to the scholarship. Michael, you don't have to. I need to, he insisted. Please, let me do this. I want to increase the funding to $50,000 annually, and I want to expand it to include visual art students as well, painters, sculptors, anyone dealing with the pressure of creative perfectionism. Sarah was crying again, but smiling through her tears. Honey, that's beautiful. Olivia never believed in boundaries between art forms, Michael said. She had friends who were dancers, painters, actors. She believed all artists face the same essential challenges: the fear of not being good enough, the pressure to be perfect, the terror of vulnerability that comes with creating something from nothing. Dr. Patterson pulled out his phone. "I'm making some calls tomorrow. I know at least a dozen concert pianists who would be interested in performing Reverie pour Olivia in a memorial concert series. We could make this piece known, bring Olivia's interpretation to life again through other artists. All proceeds could go to the scholarship fund," Elena added. "And Michael, what if we hosted an exhibition alongside the concerts? Art Without Boundaries, featuring works by scholarship recipients, both musicians and visual artists. Show the world that Olivia's legacy is about supporting artists, not separating them into categories." Michael nodded, unable to speak. Michael carefully returned the manuscript to its protective sleeve, his hands shaking slightly. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before: vulnerable, open, hopeful. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and please know I'll understand if you say no after everything I've done tonight." "What is it?" "Would you teach me to play this piece?" The request surprised everyone, including me. "Michael, you don't play piano." "I started lessons 3 months ago," he said. "I wanted to reconnect with music, to honor Olivia. I've been working with a teacher in Brooklyn twice a week. I wasn't ready to tell anyone yet. Wasn't ready to admit I was trying to heal that part of my life." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "You've been taking piano lessons for 3 months?" "I'm not very good yet," Michael admitted. "My teacher says I have decent rhythm but terrible finger independence. But I'm learning, slowly." He looked at me again. "I want to learn Olivia's piece specifically. I want to be able to play her favorite music, not perfectly like she did, but with love, with remembrance. Would you teach me?" I felt tears prick my eyes for the first time that evening. "Michael, it would be my honor. There's one more thing," he said hesitantly. "Would you mind if we called you Eleanor instead of Dr. Washington? I know you earned that title, and I know I don't deserve the familiarity after tonight, but I'd like to think of you as family rather than as an institution." "I'd like that very much," I said. "Though I should warn you, as your piano teacher, I'm going to be much harder on you than I ever was as your mother-in-law." Michael laughed, a real laugh, and suddenly he was embracing me. "Thank you," he whispered against my shoulder. "Thank you for keeping Olivia's memory alive when I couldn't. Thank you for being patient enough to wait for me to be ready. Thank you for loving my wife enough to put up with 3 years of my ignorance." "Thank you for being brave enough to heal," I whispered back. The gallery began to empty slowly. Word had clearly spread through the art world's hyperactive social media networks. Within an hour, 3 different arts journalists had shown up asking for statements. Elena handled them with professional grace, turning what could have been a scandal into a human interest story about family, loss, and reconciliation. Dr. Patterson stayed, fascinated by the manuscript and the authentication documents. "Dr. Washington, would you consider co-authoring a paper about this discovery? The implications for Debussy scholarship are significant. An unpublished work from 1894, during his transition from academic romanticism to impressionism, it could reshape our understanding of his stylistic development." "I'd be delighted," I said. "Though I should warn you, I'm a slow writer. James always said I edited myself too much." "Perfectionism runs in the family, apparently," Sarah said, appearing at my elbow with 2 glasses of wine. She handed me one. "Mom, we need to talk, really talk, about everything you've never told me." "I know, sweetheart. Why didn't you ever say you were a professor? A famous professor, apparently, based on how people are reacting. Do you know how many times I've told people my mom works with pianos like you were some kind of technician?" I took her hand. "Because after your father died, being Professor Washington felt like wearing someone else's clothes. I was just Eleanor, trying to figure out how to live in a world without James. The piano tuning was real. It was the part of music that didn't hurt, that didn't remind me of everything I'd lost. But 3 years, Mom. 3 years you let Michael treat you like—" She couldn't finish. "Like someone without education or sophistication?" I finished gently. "Sarah, Michael needed to feel competent, superior even. He was rebuilding himself after Olivia's death. If letting him explain art history to someone who already knew it, if allowing him to feel like the expert helped him heal, that was a small price to pay. It wasn't fair to you." Fairness and love aren't always the same thing, I said. Sometimes love means being smaller than you are so someone else can grow. Michael approached us, his eyes still red but calmer. I need to say something else, and Sarah needs to hear it too. We both turned to him. I've been cruel to Eleanor in small ways for 3 years, he said to Sarah. Comments about her clothes, implications that she didn't understand culture, changing subjects when she tried to contribute to conversations. I made her feel unwelcome in her own daughter's life. Michael, Sarah started. It's true, he said, and I need to own it. I need to do better, starting with actually getting to know my mother-in-law as the remarkable woman she is, not the convenient fiction I created in my head. 6 months later, the morning sun slanted through the tall windows of Michael and Sarah's brownstone in Park Slope, turning the living room golden. I sat on their comfortable sofa, a cup of coffee in my hands, listening to Michael work through the opening phrases of Reverie pour Olivia. His technique was still uncertain. His left hand tended to rush the arpeggios, and his dynamics were more enthusiastic than nuanced, but his intention was pure. This was music played with love, with remembrance, with the kind of emotional honesty that matters more than technical perfection. Remember, I said gently when he paused, Debussy wanted this to feel like a conversation with someone you love. Let the melody breathe. Don't be afraid of the silence between the notes. Michael nodded, adjusting his posture. He began again, and this time the music that emerged was simpler but more heartfelt. Not the transcendent interpretation Olivia had given it, but something equally valuable. A brother's love made audible. Better, I said. Olivia would be proud of how far you've come. Michael smiled, continuing to play. We'd been having lessons twice a week for 6 months now, and the transformation in him was remarkable. Not just his piano playing, though that was improving steadily, but in how he carried himself. He was softer now, quicker to listen, slower to judge. The manuscript itself was professionally framed and mounted on the wall above the piano, not as a museum piece, but as a living part of their home. The authentication documents hung beside it, not to prove value, but to honor the journey. Eleanor, Michael said, pausing mid-phrase, Sarah and I have some news. I looked up from the score I'd been annotating. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, her face glowing in a way that made my heart skip. We're pregnant, she announced. I set down my coffee carefully, afraid I might drop it otherwise. Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. I stood to embrace them both, feeling tears of joy prick my eyes. After 3 years of careful distance, 6 months of rebuilding, we'd finally become the family we should have been from the start. We've been talking about names, Michael said, his voice tentative. If it's a girl, we'd like to call her Olivia, but only if you think that would honor her memory properly, not overshadow it. I think Olivia would be honored to have her name carry forward, I said, my voice thick with emotion. To know that she's remembered with love, that her legacy includes new life. And if it's a boy, Sarah added, wrapping her arm around my waist, we were thinking about James, after Grandpa, and Washington as a middle name, after the grandmother who taught us that love sometimes requires patience. I couldn't speak for a moment. 3 years of careful distance, of making myself small, of waiting for exactly the right moment. All of it had led to this. A family united not by blood alone, but by shared understanding of loss, healing, and the courage to honor difficult truths. Would you play the piece one more time? I asked Michael when I could trust my voice again. I'd like Olivia to hear how beautifully you've learned her music. The memorial concert series began 3 months later at Merkin Concert Hall. Dr. Patterson had assembled an extraordinary lineup of pianists, each performing one of Olivia's favorite pieces. Reverie pour Olivia was the centerpiece, performed by 5 different artists to show how the same notes could express infinite interpretations. Michael and Sarah sat in the front row, holding hands. Sarah was showing now, her pregnancy visible in the gentle curve under her dress. I sat beside them, watching Michael's face as the first pianist began Debussy's hidden composition. The music filled the hall, gentle, contemplative, full of longing and hope. I saw tears stream down Michael's face, but he was smiling. This was grief transformed into something beautiful, pain alchemized into art. During intermission, we stood in the lobby greeting well-wishers. The scholarship fund had grown exponentially after the concert series was announced. We now supported 5 students annually, 3 musicians and 2 visual artists, all receiving not just financial assistance, but comprehensive mental health support. Dr. Washington, a young woman approached nervously. She was about 20, with dark hair and uncertain eyes. I'm Rachel Hanks. I'm one of the Olivia Bennett Scholarship recipients. Rachel, of course. I took her hand warmly. The Chopin specialist. How are your studies going? Incredibly well, thanks to the scholarship. But I wanted to tell you, she paused, gathering courage. I wanted to tell you that the counseling requirement saved my life. I was heading toward the same perfectionist spiral that... She glanced at Michael apologetically. I was in a dark place. The scholarship didn't just pay for my education. It taught me that my worth isn't determined by perfect performances. Michael stepped forward and embraced her. That's exactly what Olivia would have wanted. Thank you for telling us. As the lights flickered for the second half, we returned to our seats. The next piece was Schumann's Carnival, one of Olivia's signature works. The pianist was young, maybe 22, and she played with controlled passion that reminded me of the videos I'd watched of Olivia's performances. Michael leaned over and whispered, "Thank you for this, for all of it, for being patient enough to wait for me to be ready to remember her with joy instead of just pain. Thank you for trusting me with her story," I whispered back. 9 months after the gallery opening, I sat on my front porch in Prospect Heights, watching the sunset paint the brownstones gold and rose. My coffee had gone cold in my hands, but I didn't mind. These quiet evenings had become sacred to me, time to reflect, to remember, to appreciate how far we'd all come. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Baby kicked for the first time. Can you come over tomorrow?" I smiled, typing back, "Of course, sweetheart. I'll bring dinner." Another text, this time from Michael. "Practicing the Debussy. I think I'm finally getting the left hand right. Can't wait for you to hear it at our lesson Thursday." I looked at the framed photo on the table beside me, James and me on our 30th anniversary, both of us silver-haired and laughing. He would have loved all of this, I thought. The reconciliation with Michael, the scholarship in Olivia's name, the baby on the way. "I learned something these past few months, James," I said quietly to his photo, a habit I'd developed since he died. "I learned that at 68 years old, wisdom isn't about knowing everything. It's about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to reveal yourself and when to remain hidden." A neighbor walked by with her dog, waving. I waved back. "Sometimes the most powerful response isn't the fastest one," I continued. "Sometimes love works best when it's patient, when it waits for exactly the right moment to reveal itself. I could have confronted Michael years ago, could have demanded respect, could have forced recognition. I sipped my cold coffee, not caring about the temperature. But none of that would have healed him. None of it would have helped him remember Olivia with joy. None of it would have brought our family together the way we are now. The sun was setting fully now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have made Debussy weep. "The greatest victory," I said softly, "wasn't proving I was right. It was helping someone I love find their way back to joy. It was watching Michael play his sister's music, with tears streaming down his face but smiling. It was seeing Sarah glow with happiness because her husband and her mother finally see each other clearly." I stood slowly, my knees protesting a bit. 68 wasn't young, no matter how sharp my mind stayed. I gathered my coffee cup and James's photo, preparing to go inside. But I paused at the door, looking back at the sunset one more time. "Sometimes the people in your life are carrying more love for you than you'll ever realize," I said. "Sometimes they're making themselves smaller so you can grow. Sometimes they're waiting, patiently, hopefully, for you to be ready to receive everything they want to give you." I thought about Michael, practicing Olivia's music in the brownstone across town. About Sarah, feeling her baby kick for the first time. About young musicians learning that their worth wasn't measured in perfect performances. About a memorial concert series bringing Olivia's artistry back to life. About all the ways love works when we give it time and space and patience. "That's the real gift," I said to the empty porch, to James's memory, to the universe. "Not the manuscript worth nearly $1 million, not the scholarship or the concerts or the recognition. The real gift is watching someone heal. The real gift is being trusted with someone's grief and helping them transform it into something beautiful." I went inside as the last light faded from the sky, already planning what I'd cook for Sarah tomorrow, already looking forward to Thursday's piano lesson, already grateful for every quiet evening and every loud family dinner and every moment of this unexpected, hard-won, absolutely precious peace.